Hi everyone, thanks for being at Sharing Best Practice. Obviously it would be ideal to be there in person, and I wish I was, but this is the next best thing. So thank you for showing up to my session. I'm going to today have a look at the scientific research evidence for systematic synthetic phonics instruction. So I'm going to assume that a very large number of you, if not all of you, are familiar with SSP. So I'm not going to talk a great deal about what it is, but rather look at the research evidence that supports it, both directly and also some of the rationale and the scientific research that underpins why synthetic phonics instruction makes the most sense in terms of reading science. A little bit about me. I'm the Director of Strategy at Multilit. I'm a Senior Research Fellow within the Multilit Research Unit, and I founded and am still the Director of the 5 from 5 project. So you can have a look at the resources and information on the 5 from 5 website, 5from5.com.au, and I'll put that up again at the end of the presentation. I also work with a few different government and system authorities on developing literacy policy, including things like the syllabus, the Australian curriculum, but also, more at the school level than that as well. So I work as a critical friend with schools and school systems on developing their literacy policies, both in terms of instruction and things like assessment and intervention. Bit of an overview about what I'm going to talk about for the next 40 minutes or so. So I'll talk about why we teach phonics, what's the big deal, types of phonics instruction, why SSP in particular. So I'll go through some of the key scientific studies of reading that support SSP. I'm going to talk about how SSP aligns with learning sciences and also the way that high quality SSP accommodates the complexity of English. All right, so let's get started. Why I teach phonics. I'll go back to the simple view of reading again. I suspect that many of you are very familiar with the simple view of reading. However, it's worth revisiting it here just at least briefly because it is so important and it aligns so strongly with all of the other the research and models of reading instruction. So the simple view of reading says that reading comprehension is the product of two factors, and that is decoding or word recognition and language comprehension. So decoding or word recognition is being able to work out what the symbols on the page mean, how to translate those into a word, and then language comprehension is knowing what that word means. And so once you can work out what the word is, and if you know what the word means, then you're able to comprehend. Now that's a very simplistic way of describing it. And the simple view of reading is, superficially a simple model, but of course there's a lot going on within each of those factors. However, it's kind of deceptively simple. Studies of the simple view of reading have found that the combination of those two factors explains the very, very large majority of variance in reading comprehension. So what that means is if you can measure a student's decoding ability, if you can measure their language comprehension, when you put those together, then you've got a very, very good idea of what their reading comprehension will be. Only a very small proportion of students who are high in decoding and high on language comprehension have difficulties with reading comprehension, and we call them poor comprehenders, and they have some more specific difficulties associated with comprehending text. The other lovely thing about the simple view of reading is that it can accommodate the development in reading over time. So it describes what's going on with beginning readers as well as what is going on with skilled readers. And it's not so much a model of reading development, but it applies irrespective of the level of skill of the reader. So beginning readers, decoding is the main factor that that predicts their reading comprehension. As decoding and word recognition becomes proficient, language comprehension becomes the dominant factor. And we'll see how that aligns really strongly with other research as we move through the presentation. Just one other note before I go on. So that general rule of decoding being the main factor in the early years or in beginning reading is not quite so much the case for children who are learning to read English as an additional language or dialect, because their language comprehension skills and their oral language won't be typically as strong as their native English speaking peers. And so therefore for those students you'll see sort of more of a balance, that it will be their decoding and their language comprehension that are both strongly contributing to their reading comprehension. For English or native English speakers, they come to school with relatively well-developed language comprehension, and therefore it is the decoding that is holding them back. So oral communication is a biologically primary skill. So that means that humans have evolved to learn to communicate using oral language. Most children will have, as I just mentioned, once they've been immersed in an oral language environment, they're around people who are speaking, they are speaking to people, there's that dialogue going backwards and forwards. They will learn oral language and oral communication. However, reading and writing are different. They're what we call biologically secondary. And that means that children will not spontaneously work out how to read just by being exposed to print. Now, we all can sort of think of a very small number of what is termed precocious readers who somehow or other work it out, seemingly on their own. But in fact, they're going through the same sort of cognitive and brain processes as all other children. It's just that they are doing them or going through them more quickly. So what that means, that reading and writing is a biologically secondary skill, that means that they need to be taught, that most children aren't going to just work out how to do it on their own. And biologically secondary skills are most effectively taught using explicit and systematic instruction. Biologically primary skills are usually picked up by students through discovery and inquiry and trial and error and all those great things. But biologically secondary skills need some input. They need some instruction. Another important reason that phonics is such a big deal is that the English orthography is based on what's called the alphabetic principle. So the alphabet is just a set of symbols that were made up to represent the sounds in spoken words. And that seems obvious to us, but it's not obvious to children. And that understanding is really key to their development of their reading ability. And that really goes back to, a very fundamental understanding. So written words or print is a code for speech. And that in turn communicates meaning. And our writing system and our alphabetic system, or what we call orthography, is quite complex and possibly getting even more complex as the world becomes globalized and more languages become co-opted and new words are created. But that doesn't mean that it can't be taught in a systematic way. There is enough regularity to make it possible to teach the English writing system and the letter sound correspondences in a systematic and explicit way. And in fact, that complexity makes it very important to teach it in that way, because the patterns are not easily understood by most students. They need adults, they need a skilled instructor to explain to them how it all works. Linnea Airy came up with this set of alphabetic phases, and her research has established these as being a legitimate way of thinking about the way that children develop their knowledge of how the alphabetic code works to read words. So most children will come to school, in about the partial alphabetic phase. So the early parts of this development often does occur without any kind of systematic or explicit instruction. So children will know a few letter names, they'll know a few sounds that those letters represent. They will recognize some words in context, so usually things in environmental print like a stop sign or the name of a shop, perhaps their own name, particular things that they've seen regularly, but they'll use context will be really important for them to recognize those words. In the partial alphabetic phase, then, letter sound knowledge is growing, but they still need to use some context. So that's about where most children would be when they start school. So through instruction in those early years of school, we want to take children from the through to that automatic phase. So through the full alphabetic phase where they're able to use letter sound relationships in a systematic way to spell words, and to begin with often invented spelling using what they know about letter sound relationships rather than in a more sophisticated spelling conventions. In the consolidated alphabetic phase, they start using those spelling conventions and are able to apply them to more unfamiliar and multi-syllable words. And then in the automatic phase, they're starting to decode and spell words fluently and recognizing words almost on sight. And that's the point where they're beginning to become solid in their decoding and reading. That automatic alphabetic phase is achieved by a cognitive process called orthographic mapping. So when students have seen and read and more specifically have decoded a word many times, it's stored in their long-term memory. And it's stored not just as a letter shape, but as a unique letter string. So we remember words with each letter in their precise location. And once they're moved into long-term memory in that way, we can read them with automaticity, and the word has been orthographically mapped. So the grapheme phoneme properties of the word are extremely important here. They are, as Linnea Airy describes them, that knowledge of grapheme phoneme relationships and knowledge of the alphabetic system provides the glue that bonds orthographic to phonological identities and establishes those specific words in memory. Another piece of research or set of studies that points towards the need to learn how to decode words using all of the grapheme phoneme correspondences and properties is that other methods of reading using multiple cues, or what's known as the 3 cueing method, is less accurate and less efficient than decoding through the word, and then through that decoding process having the word orthographically mapped and then being able to retrieve it automatically. So we know now that it's not the case that the brain doesn't process every letter in a word to read it. So that was the central belief of the 3 cueing method. It was based on this idea that you just sort of sample and you can work out what a word is using context, both in terms of meaning and also in terms of the word's syntactic role in a sentence, using things like picture cues. But in fact, there's a research by Tunmer and Nicholson and others that shows that those context cues are unreliable. They only help to predict 1 in 10 content words in a text. So that's not enough for fluent reading, of course. It doesn't provide you with enough accuracy. There's a big error rate, which, obviously a high error rate in reading words means that you're not comprehending accurately what you're reading. The 3 cueing strategy also reinforces the habits of poor readers, and that is that they guess rather than paying attention, looking at the word, decoding through the word and working out what the word actually is. And there's a quote there from Torgerson and colleagues that says that putting semantic and syntactic cues on par with phonics for word reading, which is what is done in the 3 cueing method, and in fact phonics is subordinate often in the 3 cueing method, and they say that that's little better than guessing, since it often leads to learners providing words other than the target. So again, just reinforcing that idea that there's this high error rate associated with using the cueing method rather than actually decoding through the word and then having it orthographically mapped for automatic retrieval. So what do the reading scientists say about phonics and the need for phonics instruction so that you can and students learn to decode words? Keith Stanovich says that direct instruction in alphabetic coding facilitates early reading instruction acquisition is one of the most well-established conclusions in all of behavioural science. And Mark Seidenberg has said, for reading scientists, the evidence that the phonological pathways used in reading, and especially important in beginning reading, is about as close to conclusive as research on complex human behaviour can get. So it's a pretty definitive statement there from those two reading scientists. So I'll talk now a little bit about the different types of phonics instruction. I think all teachers would say that they teach phonics. It's widely accepted that phonics is necessary as part of effective reading instruction, but not all approaches to phonics instruction are effective. So first of all, and this relates to the 3 cueing method that I mentioned about earlier, is implicit or incidental or embedded phonics, and it's also known as phonics in context. So this has lots of different names. Essentially, it is the idea that you do not need to teach grapheme-phoneme correspondences in a systematic way, that rather students will work out the relationships between letters and sounds, and they'll work through that alphabetic process of alphabetic phases just by being read to and by attempting to read themselves. There's no scope and sequence that makes sure that grapheme phoneme correspondences are all taught and mastered, and it employs that 3 cueing system. Essentially, phonics in context is a top-down approach. So it asks students to sort of try and get some sort of gist of the meaning, and then try to work out what the words are based on their sort of overall sense of the meaning of the text. There might be some memorization of individual words, and then when students come to a word they don't know, they try to work it out using context cues. So this approach is not supported by scientific reading research, and I'm sure you can understand why, given what I've already said, but in what follows in this presentation, it'll become even clearer why phonics in context is not an effective way to teach accurate and efficient word reading. Another approach that is often used to teaching phonics and is still relatively widely used is analytic and onset rhyme phonics. So that is an approach that starts with whole words and then analyzes those words and looks for commonalities in words. So teaches things in words in word families. So there is some attention to letter sound correspondences, of course. There's an understanding that there is an alphabet there, an alphabetic principle. But instead of breaking words down into their smallest components, analytic phonics looks at word families. So there isn't really a good recommended developmental sequence in terms of teaching grapheme phoneme correspondences in analytic and onset rhyme phonics. It can be done in a sort of roughly systematic way, but it takes a really long time to teach all of the word families in that way. So that creates quite a high cognitive load as opposed to, say, teaching single grapheme phoneme correspondences. And I'm going to talk about a bit more about that later in the presentation. Systematic synthetic phonics, however, starts with the very smallest subunits or components of words. And synthetic means building words. It doesn't mean fake. It means starting from those very smallest parts of words and then teaching students that there is a systematic way to look at decoding words using the relationships between letters and sounds. Systematic synthetic phonics also has a developmental sequence from simple to complex, and students begin to learn how to blend and segment words very early in the process. So sometimes I hear the argument that systematic synthetic phonics teaches children to read all of the GPCs in isolation before they start to learn how to read words, and that's absolutely untrue. Systematic synthetic phonics is, hyper aware of the fact that blending to read words is a skill that needs to be introduced as early as possible, so that children can start developing that skill, but also so they can see the point of what they're doing, that you can manipulate the graphemes and phonemes in words, and in manipulating them they can make new words in a predictable way. So SSP taught well means that children can start to read words using the simple code within a few months. In the first half of the first year of school, children will be starting to read simple consonant, vowel, consonant words using their regular GPCs. And then over the course of the next 2 to 3 years, they will have mastered the extended code, if it's taught in a really systematic and sequential way. So why is systematic synthetic phonics instruction the most effective way to approach accurate and efficient word reading? So let's first of all have a look at the reading brain and the reading brain research, and just a summary here from Stanislas Dehaene. And going back to what I said before about biologically and secondary skills, Stanislas said that because reading is an extremely recent invention in evolutionary terms, and until recently concerned a small minority of humans, so universal literacy is only, a few hundred years old, the human genome cannot contain any instructions for reading specific brain circuits. Instead, we have to recycle existing brain systems for this novel use. And in order to do that, we need instruction that creates those brain circuits. In this little diagram here, which is from a paper by Kathy Russell, it's just showing you how the connections that need to be made. So from sound to spelling, vice versa, sound to meaning and vice versa, and spelling to meaning and vice versa. The dual root cascaded model is a computational model of what is going on in the reading brain. And what is so important about this model is that it describes the difference between a beginning reader and a skilled reader or an expert reader. The brain of a skilled reader is different to the brain of a beginning reader. And so in order for the skilled reader brain to be achieved, certain cognitive processes need to be built, and those neurological networks need to be built. Now, the key difference between a skilled reader and a novice reader is that a skilled reader is able to look at a word and read it relatively automatically. They use what is called the lexical route. However, a beginning reader is using what is described as the phonological route. So they need to be able to decode the word, to sound it out, to say it aloud, either actually say it out loud or hear it mentally through silent decoding. But that is how they access the meaning of the word to begin with. And that is because they're highly dependent on their oral language and making a match between the words that they're reading and the words that they know. Over time, as we described earlier, words become moved into long-term memory, and eventually the skilled reader is able to read words automatically using what's called the lexical route. They don't need to go through those phonological properties and actually hear the word in order to understand it. So that's a key understanding in the scientific reading research. This diagram pulls together the simple view of reading and the dual root cascaded model, and it's in a relatively recent publication by Romanovska and Bonti. And they say that when learning to read, children initially rely mostly on the dorsal network, in particular to map letters and eventually letter strings onto corresponding speech sounds. So at the top of that diagram, you can see there's a dorsal system or dorsal network, and that's in the green circle, and there's some little sound waves above that and the text. So that is the connections between sound and print, and it is the dominant factor. So its relative contribution to reading there is shown in the column graph with the pink and the green, and the green column there is higher. That it's showing there that dorsal system is the main one that's being used in the early stages of reading. In the middle, we've got repeated practice, and that, the instruction that goes along with that. And over time, with continued practice, the ventral and dorsal networks are integrated. And that's by having those integrated representations of the orthographic, phonological, and semantic features of words. And effortful letter-for-letter reading and emerging phonological and orthographic knowledge create that ability to read fluency, because it creates it strengthens the connections between the dorsal and the ventral system. So you can see there and there at the bottom of the graph now, for fluent readers, the pink circle becomes dominant, but also there's much more overlap, so they're working together. But the relative contribution of that ventral system, which is drawing on language comprehension, becomes the dominant one once that fluent reading level has been achieved. So these findings aren't just esoteric or insignificant. They add to the evidence that when we read, we're not predicting based on context the way that whole language proponents would have us believe, but actually we are visually processing every word using its phonological and lexical properties. So again, drawing together those two essential elements for accurate and efficient word reading. Eye movement studies also give us some really interesting clues to what is going on when people read, and the connections between eye and brain. So Keith Rayner and his colleagues have had a decades-long program of eye movement studies that have contributed an enormous amount to our knowledge about what is going on in terms of what the eye is seeing and what the brain is gleaning, and the interaction between those two things. So some of the findings that are really relevant for the way we're thinking about how children learn to read and what is going on when people read is that when the eye first fixates or focuses on a word, it lands, or its landing position is usually between the first letter and the center of the word. And so what it's doing there is maximizing the amount of information that it has in focus. So this is particularly relevant, of course, to reading in languages that read from left to right. So by landing, towards the left-hand side or the beginning of the word, and as the eye moves across the page, there's more information focused on to the right of the focal point. The second finding is that less familiar words are fixated closer to the first letter in the word. So what that indicates to us is that the brain has worked out fairly rapidly that that word isn't necessarily one that has been orthographically mapped, that it might need to actually pay a bit more attention to the letters in the word, and so therefore it moves its focus towards the beginning of the word so to make sure that no information is missed. And that's true also for refixation. So when the reader or the brain works out that perhaps they've misread a word, or if something doesn't make sense, perhaps there's a typo, trying to work out what's going on, when it moves back and refocuses on that word, it moves closer to the first letter of the word, again to make sure that no letters are missed. When skilled readers fixate on a word in the center of their vision, they're also previewing the next word. So that is what allows us to read fluently. If you only saw one word at a time, then fluent reading would not really be possible, because you would just literally be going from word to word. What we're doing is we're sort of scanning slightly ahead as we're reading, and that partial processing of the next few words is actually going on through the phonological properties of the word rather than, thinking it, or the brain's not paying attention to the context of the word. It's actually paying attention to the phonological properties. So again, that's another thing that indicates to us that there's grapheme phoneme correspondences, and every single bit of letter sound relationship in those words is highly relevant when we're reading it. There's also the finding that if readers skip a word, it's usually not a content word. And so therefore that points us to the idea that the brain is already knowing which words are very familiar, and it's paying attention to the words that it knows that it needs to actually focus on the grapheme phoneme correspondences and make sure that word is accurate. Now let's have a look at some of the scientific studies that support systematic synthetic phonics. So there are multiple ways that we can break a word up into its subword unit components, and research has strongly shown that phonemes and letters are the critically important subword units for students to know. So scientific studies have repeatedly found that letter sound knowledge and phoneme awareness are significant and critical causal predictors of early literacy skills. And Susan Brady says that in sum, the convergent research evidence for the importance of phoneme awareness and letter skills is indisputable. So clearly, that has relevance for our support for systematic synthetic phonics, because that is where systematic synthetic phonics is focused. It is focused on teaching phoneme awareness, so children can segment and blend, and the letter sound knowledge that allows them to decode and to spell words. So there's not just one study supporting that, there are numerous studies supporting phonemes and letters as being the critical subword units for students to know and to understand and be able to work with. In contrast, there isn't any evidence that using morphemes as the basis for beginning reading instruction is an effective approach. However, there is mixed evidence that using a morpheme-based word analysis can be helpful for reading and spelling for older primary school students. So when we think about that, a morpheme is the meaningful unit of a word. So each morpheme, though, is made up of grapheme phoneme correspondences. So in order for a student to be able to read morphemes, they need to be able to read the GPCs. So that larger subword unit is not an effective way to approach early reading instruction. The other way that you can break a word up into subword units is to look at onset and rhyme. So I mentioned that earlier in terms of analytic phonics instruction, but scientific research studies have shown that systematically teaching students to use grapheme phoneme correspondences, GPCs, to decode words, so that is through systematic synthetic phonics instruction, is more accurate and more efficient than using onset and rhyme analysis. So that is alphabetic phonics. So remember, so onsets, rhymes and morphemes are all made up of GPCs. So unless you are asking students to memorize those larger subword units, which is not an efficient or accurate strategy without reference to the GPCs that make them up, they're still going to need to learn how to decode. So it just makes sense just to start with the GPCs first rather than trying to move backwards to teach the grapheme phoneme properties. In a program of research and analysis by Jonathan Solity, Janet Vousden and their colleagues, they came up with something called the simplicity principle. So they worked out the percentage of words in real children's books, so not decodable books, and real is a subjective term, but non-constrained children's books that can be read when students have learned GPCs and common irregular words taught in a number of different programs. So the point was not so much to compare the programs, but rather that to work out what proportion of words could be read once children had been taught a relatively small number of grapheme phoneme correspondences and what they call common exception words, but which probably we would be more likely to refer to as high frequency irregular words. So Optima Reading, in Optima Reading, we're taught 58 common exception words, 60 GPCs, and that allowed students to read, or gave them the ability to read, 75% of words in those children's books. And there is a bit of variation there among those programs. But the point is really that there's a fairly limited number of GPCs and a fairly limited number of high frequency words that need to be taught in order to get children very much on the road to independent reading. By comparison, they worked out that students would need to know 334 onset and rhyme families in order to read that same percentage of words. So obviously that's a lot more information. There's a much higher cognitive load that's required for the same effect if you're teaching using onset and rhyme and analytic phonics rather than a synthetic phonics approach alongside common exception words or high frequency irregular words. One of the most famous studies that has been done comparing systematic synthetic phonics with analytic phonics in an experimental project in schools is called the Clackmannanshire study, and that study was done in the early 2000s, and it really was highly influential on the formulation of reading policy and reading instruction in England through the Rose Review and the Rose Report. So in the Clackmannanshire study, it involves students in their first year of formal schooling. It compared three groups of students, so students who were learning synthetic phonics, students who were learning analytic phonics, and students who were learning a combination of analytic phonics and phonemic awareness. So all the students in the different programs had 20 minutes per day of this sort of instruction for 16 weeks. At the end of that 16 weeks, synthetic phonics groups had significantly higher reading outcomes, and that also extended to the end of the first year and was maintained 7 years later. So that's quite a dramatic kind of result. So this graph here shows the growth in word reading over time through the years of school, compares boys and girls, and it shows that the boys' word reading and the girls' word reading was above their chronological age once they've had that synthetic phonics instruction in the first year of school. And you know, it really is quite a remarkable study that it followed those students all the way through primary school, and that the effects were maintained, not just maintained, but actually continued to grow. And this is the comprehension findings. So this comparison of reading comprehension from primary 2, so second year of primary school, to primary 7, so essentially year 6, for advantaged and disadvantaged children. And again, they're really, you know, it's quite remarkable because there's very little difference in the comprehension scores of children in advantaged and disadvantaged groups. Which just shows the power of that instruction in word reading in the early years of school to kickstart children through to higher comprehension. Obviously, there was a lot more going on there, and as we know from the simple view of reading, decoding and word reading is not enough. So that can't have been the only thing happening, but it certainly has, in this study, had a very dramatic impact. This is an Australian study by Christiansen and Bowey in 2005, and it was with students in their second year of school, so year 1. It compared orthographic rhyme, so essentially onset rhyme, grapheme phoneme correspondence phonics, so systematic synthetic phonics, and whole language, so 3 different groups of students. And again, 20 minutes per day for this time 14 weeks. So the orthographic rhyme and GPC groups both had higher outcomes than the whole language. So the systematic approaches had higher outcomes than the whole language approach on the basic accuracy of reading taught words. However, the GPC phonics group, which is essentially systematic synthetic phonics, had significantly higher outcomes than the other groups on more advanced reading measures and the transfer to new untaught words. So the significance of that is that that ability for students who have had that instruction in GPCs and in phonics and how to use them to decode any word, essentially, allows them to read unfamiliar words and to apply that knowledge as they read more and more words independently. In terms of effect sizes of the studies of systematic phonics instruction and systematic synthetic phonics instruction, I'm not sure how well you can see this slide, and I'll just summarise those findings there. You can find that table in the Learning Difficulties Australia Bulletin from 2020 in its volume 52, issue 1. And that table there just lists the effect sizes that have been found in various different studies that have looked at systematic phonics and systematic synthetic phonics. And the take home is that they're high effect sizes. They're what would be considered to be significant and substantial effects from using systematic synthetic phonics in particular, and particularly for students in the early years of school and particularly for struggling readers. So, altogether, those research findings very strongly support the use of the SSP method for teaching word reading. Now, systematic synthetic phonics isn't just about the content, and this is a really important point to make. It's not just about the GPCs and the blending and the segmenting. It's very much about, and the effectiveness of it is based on the fact that its pedagogy is rooted very firmly in the findings of the learning sciences. And SSP programs will involve all of these things. They'll involve attention and active engagement. They'll involve spaced repetition and exposure, spaced and regular recall, practice in different contexts. And all of those things will be helping to move things from working memory and short-term memory into long-term memory, along with things like feedback and error correction, explanation of as much as possible, but given the age, the developmental appropriateness of these explanations, of how that knowledge all fits together, the relevance of the knowledge in terms of the aim that's of reading and reading for meaning, and making connections to existing knowledge. So you'll recognise all of those things as being features of explicit instruction. And explicit instruction very much draws upon what we know from cognitive science about moving things into long-term memory and then being able to use that information to generalize. This is a very recent study that I think is fascinating, and it was by Kathy Rassel and colleagues, and it was published last year. So this study is with adults, but it really demonstrates the power of explicit instruction versus discovery, and again sort of brings us back to that idea of biologically secondary skills and the need to explain how this code works. So with this particular study, adults were taught new words in an artificial alphabet that was made up for the purposes of the study. Unlike English, the writing system was highly consistent. So one symbol represented one sound. One group of adults had explicit instruction in the symbol-sound relationships, as you would do in systematic synthetic phonics. The other group had to try and work out the orthographic structure of the words through reading. So that was more of a discovery approach. They had to sort of work out, what is the commonalities or what are the patterns here, and try to work out what the code was using a discovery method. And this is what happened. Virtually all of the people in the explicit instruction group were able to read the new words and work out their meanings. But only 5 of the 24 participants in the discovery learning group showed the same level of performance. So that is, the people who had been explicitly taught the underlying structure of the language were able to transfer that knowledge to decode and read new words using their knowledge of those sound to symbol relationships. But very few of those who had tried to learn it using that whole word discovery method were able to transfer to read novel or new words. So it's pretty rare for scientists to describe a piece of research as having drastic or dramatic findings, but in this case it's pretty clear that that's what they showed, that explicit instruction was much more powerful than discovery. So SSP isn't just something that's out in the ether. It's has been now used in many schools, and in fact we have a really good case study in English schools. So systematic synthetic phonics became mandated in English primary schools in 2007. So look, there's a really enormous amount of data now that can be used to give us some indication of the success of using that approach in a large number of schools with very large numbers of students. One study that was done published in 2018 looked at student performance in the first 5 years after the English government mandated synthetic phonics. And what that study found was significant improvement in reading among 5 and 7-year-old children across the board. So all 5 and 7-year-old children had improved as a result of bringing in SSP. At age 11, the most improved outcomes were for children from disadvantaged non-English speaking backgrounds. So reinforcing again that for children who don't come to school with the advantages of being from a home where English is spoken and where there is a high level of literacy engagement, the necessity for this explicit systematic approach is so much greater. So Macon et al. Said that we are able to provide convincing evidence of causal effects from the introduction of synthetic phonics in English primary schools. This policy reduced literacy inequalities in primary school at relatively low cost. Another evaluation which published recently by Rona Stainthorpe in a book that was published by Multilit recently. It looks at the literacy data following the introduction of both the mandated SSP and the Year 1 phonics screening check in English primary schools over the last decade or so. And in fact, it's 15 years since SSP was brought in and 10 years since the phonics screening check was brought in. And Rona says that the research evidence about effective phonics teaching has fed into teaching practices and is now sufficiently embedded such that all primary teachers have some expertise. The reduction in the tail of underachievement is something to be celebrated. In the article, Rona includes a few graphs here. So the black bars take us up to 2015, at which point the key stage tests changed. So this is not just looking at results in decoding. This is looking at results in the key stage 1, which is the comprehension test at the end of year 2, and the key stage 2, which is the comprehension test at the end of year 6. And we can see there that from 1996 up to 2015, there was an improvement that accelerated towards the end of that period, towards 2015, when the phonics check was brought in, particularly in that key stage 1 assessment. But there was certainly, the results in 2014 and 2015 were the highest that they ever had been. Fortunately to some extent, because the tests became much more rigorous, which, is better over time, but in terms of our analysis of trends, makes things a little bit difficult. But from 2016 to 2019, there was some stability there in the grades or the scores in Key Stage 1. Key Stage 2, they continued to improve. So we could see some continuing growth in those Key Stage 2 scores. So that's Year 6 in reading comprehension. Evaluations of high-performing schools find that one thing they have in common is they're using systematic synthetic phonics, and that's around England and in Australia. And there are 3 particular studies that I have cited there. One looking at high-performing schools in WA, another in England, which is Ofsted, and then Blaise Joseph did one looking at schools around Australia. And those high-performing schools, without exception, were using systematic synthetic phonics for early years reading. So one challenge that's often raised around SSP is that it doesn't really account for the complexity of English, and that's certainly not true. In terms of irregular words, yes, the English language has quite a few what we'd call irregular words, although they are on a scale from relatively more regular to relatively more irregular. There are only a very small number of words that you'd say were truly irregular. However, learning regular GPCs and gradually expanding knowledge to accommodate the variation in words is the best strategy, rather than trying to expose children to all the possible permutations and all the possible letter-sound correspondences all at once. And that is a hallmark of SSP, that start with the irregularities so that we can build that understanding of the alphabetic principle, and then gradually moving to more complex. And when you think about the irregular words, many of the sounds or GPCs within that word would be relatively regular, and it's more often than not the vowel sound that is irregular. And there's good research showing that something called set for variability is a really good way of accommodating those irregularities. So knowing which of the more regular GPCs allows students to get a very good approximation of what the word might be. And then if the first vowel sound they try doesn't sound like a word they know, and doesn't make sense, they can try a different vowel sound, or in a way which is called vowel flexing. So when you think about the word swan, a child might initially sound it out as swan, and then over time, or they'll realizing that that doesn't match with a word that they know, try a different variation on the vowel sound until they land on swan. Over time that becomes orthographically mapped, and also as their knowledge of the phonic code develops, they will know that there are other words where the A grapheme represents an O sound when it follows the W. But that doesn't need to be known, all of that, straight away. And so teaching the regularities, allowing set for variability, and then gradually building up complexity and understanding of orthographic and spelling conventions will take children much further and in a much more consolidated and cumulative way that allows them to make generalizations than trying to learn everything at once. There's also good evidence that teaching high-frequency words alongside a scope and sequence of grapheme phoneme correspondences doesn't interfere with their learning of the phonic code, doesn't create confusion that impedes their learning. And in fact, as we saw with the simplicity principle, the combination of those two things, of carefully selected high frequency words and a limited set of them alongside grapheme phoneme correspondences, allows students to read connected text in books more quickly. And a recent review of research has confirmed that learning some high frequency words by rote, and again, a really small number of carefully chosen words, is a faster route to reading a higher number of words. And I've included there a picture of the very useful word tree that was created by Emma Lockwood. Again, there is no pretense in SSP that morphemes don't matter, but really that they should be taught alongside systematic phonics instruction, and again with a carefully planned scope and sequence, so that we're introducing the most common and well understood morphemes as early in the sequence as it makes sense to. So the aim is to have children reading words accurately and efficiently in the largest number of words possible, as quickly as possible. And so that is the ultimate aim of designing a program. So not pretending that there are different elements to reading words and to the English language, but coming up with a way that doesn't overload students, but also allows them to learn to read as quickly and successfully as possible. So in summary, SSP is strongly aligned to scientific evidence. It builds those necessary neurological connections between the visual or grapheme and phonological or phoneme characteristics of words. It develops the phonological route, which is absolutely necessary for beginning readers, and it's an initial and essential cognitive process. It establishes these connections quickly and firmly using highly effective instructional principles, those learning science principles that I mentioned, and moves that information into long-term memory and minimizes the cognitive load. Learning to decode through the word facilitates orthographic mapping, which leads to skilled and proficient reading and the automaticity that we're looking for. The blending and segmenting of GPCs is introduced early to allow the cumulative introduction of new GPCs, and that allows the decoding of new words and facilitates self-teaching. So getting to that point, that jumping off point where students can start to use their phonic knowledge to read an increasing number of novel words. The successful self-teaching using phonic knowledge accelerates the acquisition of sight words. So by sight words, I mean words that can be read automatically on sight that have been orthographically mapped, not sight words as in rote learned word shapes. And this way it develops the lexical root of that dual root cascaded model. And again, that leads to that fluent and proficient reading that allows students to read automatically and to focus on comprehension. And the pace of SSP can be adjusted to the learning needs of individual students. So mastery is really important. You can move quickly when students are learning quickly, slow down when there is content that needs more attention. And that can be adjusted on the basis of a class or on the basis of an individual. So for more information on this, 5 from 5 has a professional development series. It's all free. They're all live online, and we run a few sessions of each of these each term. At the moment, we've got 3 sessions available: Science of Reading, a deep dive into systematic synthetic phonics. So if you've attended this session today and you want to know more about how to teach systematic synthetic phonics, then that's the session for you. That's a longer one, 2 hours. There's a session on reading fluency. And then we have a new session that we'll be introducing next term, which is on oral language and vocabulary in the primary school. So I think I've unfortunately covered up the QR code with my face. So you can just go to